Chapter 4 Timescales. This text is, for the most part, a clear manuscript written in black nib pen in a mostly careful hand, on 10 sides of 5 sheets of unlined paper. Tolkien's often lengthy, interpolated notes, here given as footnotes, are in a smaller and italic hand, but likewise careful. It was later supplied with some marginal notes, here given as footnotes, and additions in red ballpoint pen. The text dates to c. 1959. Timescales. The Valar, having entered Arda and being therein confined within its life, must also suffer while therein, and being as it were its spirit as the Fea as to the Heroa of the Incarnate, its slow aging. Footnote 1. CFX 401. The Valar fade and become more impotent, precisely in proportion as the shape and constitution of things becomes more defined and settled. End footnote. The Quendi, being immortal within Arda, also aged with Arda, as regards their Heroar, but since, unlike the Valar, whose true life was not corporeal, and who assumed bodily forms at will as raiment, their being was incarnate and consisted naturally of the union of a Fea and a Heroa. This aging was felt chiefly in the Heroa. Footnote 2. On the natural unity of Heroa, body, and Fea, spirit, and incarnates, see body and spirit in Appendix 1. End footnote. This, as the Eldar say, was slowly consumed by the Fea, until instead of dying and being discarded to dissolution, it became absorbed and eventually became no more than the memory of its habitation of old, which the Fea retained. Thus, they became or have now become mostly invisible to human eyes. Footnote 3. CFX 427. Then an elf would begin to fade until the Fea, as it were, consumed the Heroa until it remained only in the love and memory of the spirit that had inhabited it. End footnote. But this has taken long ages to come about. In the beginning, the Heroa of the elves, being supported and nourished by the great strength of their Fëanor, were vigorous, resisting hurts, and healing such as they suffered swiftly from within. Their aging was, therefore, extremely slow by mortal standards, though they were in their early days as physical as men, or even more so, more strong, vigorous, and swift in body, and taking greater delight in all bodily pleasures and exercises. If we disregard the actual time, measured in the sun years of Middle-earth, but use years merely as the units of measurement in the growth from birth to maturity proper to each kind, it will be observed that the Quendi resemble the Atani in this process. Their Fëanor never reached maturity in the sense of ceasing to be capable of further increase of knowledge and wisdom, but they did reach a stage when memory, both of thought and labor, as well as of the events of history general, and to each one particular, began to be a burden, or began more and more to occupy their thought and emotion. But this development, which marks the aging of the Quendi, did not concern the elder days, and first became evident during the Second Age, increasing rapidly during the Third Age when the dominion of man was finally achieved. The Heroar of the Quendi had, however, definite rhythm and process similar to that of men. They reached maturity at about the age of 20, asterisk, elf men 24, women c. 18, and asterisk, and remained in full physical vigor till about the age of 60, after which the Fea in its interest began to assume command. After about the age of 90 to 96, one of the Quendi had reached a stage similar to that of a vigorous and hale mortal of high age and wisdom. Footnote 4. The age range 90 to 96 was a later alteration of original 100. Note that the corresponding passage in the typescript text, Chapter 3 of Time in Arda above, has 100 in both this case and that in the next endnote. End footnote. The normal period, therefore, for marriage and the begetting and bearing of children and their nurture, which were one of the greatest delights of the Quendi and Arda, was between about the ages of 20 and 60. The Quendi differed, however, from men in the following important aspects. If we speak only of them in the earlier ages of their life, in Arda, individuals were more variable, so that the ages defined above of 20, 60, 90 are only general and approximate. Footnote 5. The age 90 here was likewise a later alteration of original 100. End footnote. After maturity, at about 20, their minds and wills had far more control over the events of the body and over the direction of the uses, and the serial ordering of the uses of the body's powers and functions. For instance, after maturity, one of the Quendi could marry and at once enter into the time of the children, but they could postpone marriage or within marriage postpone the time of the children, either because they were otherwise occupied in pursuits that absorbed them, or because they had not found a desired spouse, or as men say, fallen in love. Asterisk. In this matter, the Elven tongues make distinctions to speak of Quenya, love, which men might call friendship, but for the greater strength and warmth and permanency with which it was felt by the Quendi, was represented by root mel. This was primarily emotion or inclination of the Fea, and therefore could occur between persons of the same sex or different sexes. It included no sexual or procreative desire, though naturally in incarnates the difference of sex altered the emotions, since sex is held by the Eldar to belong also to the Fea, and not solely to the Heroa, and is therefore not wholly included in procreation. Such persons were often called Melotorni, love brothers, and Melotheldi, love sisters. The desire for marriage and bodily union was represented by root yer, but this never in the uncorrupted occurred without love, root mel, nor without the desire for children. This element was therefore seldom used except to describe occasions of its dominance in the process of courting and marriage. The feelings of lovers desiring marriage and of husband and wife were usually described by root mel. This love remained, of course, permanent after the satisfaction of root yer in the time of the children, but was strengthened by this satisfaction and the memory of it to a normally unbreakable bond of feeling, not here to speak of law. Two other stems were also concerned with feelings that we should often call love, root and dil and root and dur. These generally did not concern individuals or persons, and were unconnected with sex in either Fea or Heroa. Root and dil is best compared with English, phile in Anglophile, bibliophile, etc., or especially with philo as in philosophy or philology. It expressed a feeling of special concern with, care for, or interest in things, such as metals, or lower creatures as birds or trees, or processes of thought and inquiry as history or arts, as poetry, or in groups of persons as elves or dwarfs. Thus, Elendil becomes Elendil, lover of the Eldar, or Elendil of the stars, Earendil, lover of the sea, Valendil, lover of the Valar. It may be called love because while its mainspring was a concern with things other than self for their own sakes, it included a personal satisfaction in that the inclination was part of the lover's inherent character, and study or service of the things loved were necessary to his or her fulfillment. Root and dur seems originally to have referred to devotions and interests of a less personal kind, to fidelity and devotion in service produced by circumstances rather than inherent character. Thus, an Ornandil is one who loved trees and who, in addition, no doubt to studying to understand them, took an especial delight in them, but an Ornandur was a tree keep, a forester, a woodsman, a man concerned with trees, as we might say professionally. But since, certainly among the free Eldar, root and dur was normally accompanied by root and dil or personal interests, and even by root mel, for the Eldar held that this emotion can rightly be felt by incarnates for other than persons, since they are akin to all things in Arda, though their Heroa and through the interest of their Fea, each in its own Heroa, and so in all substances of Arda. The distinction between Indil and Endur, especially in later Quenya names as used by elves or men, become obscured. In ordinary words, the distinction was roughly that between amateur and professional, though not including any question of remuneration. And asterisk. Footnote 6. In this long footnote, the CE root yer at both occurrences is a replacement of a previous form heavily struck through, but possibly root uyer. On love as primarily a motion or inclination of the fea, cfx 233. On the dual ends of marriage, unity and procreation, see the discussion of marriage in Appendix 1. On the kinship of incarnates to all things in order, through their heroar, see Chapter 2, Primal Impulse, in Part 3 of this volume. With a normally unbreakable bond of feeling, not here to speak of law, see Tolkien's Laws and Customs Among the Eldar, X207FF, for a closely contemporary, thematically related, and expansive discussion of marriage among the elves. End footnote. Or for reasons of prudence or necessity imposed by circumstances as in times of trouble, wandering, and exile. Postponement of the fulfillment of marriage affected the length of time in which the heroa remained in full vigor of maturity. For the use of these bodily powers absorbed, relatively to men, more of the corporeal vigor of the Quendi and more also, though in less degree, of the youth of the Fea. Asterisk. Their youth the Quendi call that part of their lifetime in which the body is still dominant. And asterisk. So that in certain cases marriage might take place between Quendi of the age of 60 or even rarely of greater age. It may also be noted that in each elvish life there was normally only one period of begetting or bearing children whenever begun, and that the length of this period was variable as were the number of children produced. It might occupy from 12 to about 60 years, occasionally more. Footnote 7. The ages 12 and 60 here are later replacements for original 10 and 50 respectively. And footnote. The children numbered usually 2, 3, or 4. One was exceptional and could be due to different causes. For instance, the separation of the spouses, as in the case of Idril, daughter and sole child of Turgon of Gondolin, whose wife, Anire of the Vanyar, would not go with the Noldor into exile but remained with Indis, also of the Vanyar, widow of Finwë. Footnote 8. In Chapter 10, Difficulties in Chronology below, Anire is said to have been the mother of Idril and to have refused the exile. In all other published sources that name her, Anire is the wife of Fingolfin and thus Idril's grandmother, not mother. Cf. XI 323, XII 363, and footnote. In other cases, the spouses, one or both, might not desire more than one child. This was rare, and in the histories of the elder days occurred only when some child of exceedingly great qualities was born which, as the Eldar say, demanded far more of the vigor and life of the parents than a normal child. The most eminent case was that of Miriel, mother of the most gifted of all the Noldor, Feanor. Another case was that of Luthien, daughter of Elwë and Meliana, Elu, Thingol, and Melian. Footnote 9. Elwë and Meliana are the Quenya forms of the Sindarin names Elu and Melian respectively. End footnote. Though this case was also unique in that Meliana was not an elf, but of the race of the Valar or Maya cross. That is, a divine spirit coeval with the great Valar, but of less power and authority than the Valar whom they served. Melian assumed, as the Valar and Maiar could, the raiment of the children, the incarnates, out of love for them. Only one of the greatest of the Eldar in the early vigor could have supported a union of that sort, unique in all known tales. But Melian, having in woman form born a child after the manner of the incarnate, desired to do this no more. By the birth of Luthien, she became enmeshed in incarnation, unable to lay it aside while husband and child remained in Arda alive, and her powers of mind, especially foresight, became clouded by the body through which it must now always work. To have borne more children would still further have changed her and trammeled her. In the event, her daughter became mortal and eventually died, and her husband was slain, and she then cast off her raiment and left Middle-earth. And cross-note. Footnote 10. On the increased fixing of soul and body together with increased usage among those not naturally incarnate, see Chapter 9 of Samveganta in Part 2 of this book, and Body and Spirit in Appendix 1. End footnote. A greater number than 4 was rare, though in the early days of the full vigor of the Eldar, 5 or 6 children are recorded to have been born to one pair of spouses. Double cross note, especially in the youth time before the Great March. And double cross note. 7 was wholly exceptional, and indeed among the High Elves only the case of Feanor is recorded. He had 7 sons. The last 2 were twins, Amrod and Amras. Twins were very rare, and this is the only case recorded of the Eldar in the ancient histories except for the twin sons, Eldun and Elrune of Dur Eluchiel, but he was half Elven. In later times, Third Age, Elrond had twin sons. Footnote 11. With Eldun and Elrune as the twin sons of Dior, cf. XI 257, 316, and 349-50. These names were in Tolkien's last writings replaced with Elured and Elurin, cf. XII 369, 372, and 8. End footnote. It must be remembered, however, in considering the records and legends of the past, that these, especially those made by or handed down through men, often only mention or name persons who play a recorded part in the events or were the direct ancestors of such chief actors. It cannot therefore be concluded from silence alone, whether in narrative or in genealogy, that any given person had no children or no more than are named. An Elven child was born in its mother's womb for about the same relative time as a mortal child, that is, for about 3/4 of a youth year equals 3/4 of 12, Loar equals 9. Loar, asterisk, actually a length of time equals mortal 96 months or 8 years, and asterisk. Though in the Quendi this period was more variable, often being less, and on rare occasions being more. Footnote 12. As first written, the gestation period was given as 9 months, or 3/4 of a loa. The alteration was made in red ballpoint pen. The correction to 96 months, or 8 years, entered as a marginal note in pencil. End footnote. It is said that Feanor remained in the womb for 1 growth year, 12 Loar. Footnote 13. As first written, this sentence ended for 1 year. The alteration was made in red ballpoint pen. End footnote. The Onalume, or Time of the Children, was in normal lives a continuous series, occupying some 12 to 60 years. Footnote 14. As first written, the range of years was given as 10 to 50 years. The alteration was made in red ballpoint pen. End footnote. The interval between the birth of a child and the next birth was usually 1 growth year equals 12 Loar, but was often more, and in a continuous series tended to become longer, more rest being needed between each birth. Thus, 12 Loar before the second birth, 24 before the third, 36 before the fourth, 42 before the fifth, and 48 before the sixth. But the intervals could be longer and not necessarily in exact 12s. Footnote 15. As first written, this paragraph ended. The next birth was usually from 3 to 9 years, but it might range from 2 years, very rarely less, to 12 years, seldom more. The alteration was made in red ballpoint pen. An earlier version of this paragraph heavily struck through, as first written has, gestation taking about 1 year, the days of begetting and of birth being normally the same or nearly so. The time of the children, Ontalume or Onalume, was in normal lives a continuous series, occupying 10 to 50 years. The interval between children was sometimes less than 2 or as much as 12 years. Cf. X 2:12. As for the begetting and bearing of children, a year passes between the begetting and the birth of an elf child, so that the days of both are the same or nearly so, and it is the day of begetting that is remembered year by year. This paragraph was subsequently altered in black nib pen to read, gestation occupied on the average about the same time period as among mortals, though it was perhaps more variable, often being speedier and on occasion longer. Feanor was born in the womb for a whole year. The time of the children, Ontalume or Onalume, was in normal lives a continuous series occupying 10 to 50 years. The interval between children was between 3 to 9 years, but might be from 2, rarely less, to 12 years, rarely more. The whole was then struck through in black nib pen. End footnote. But in comparing Quendi with men, it must be observed that the unit, called a year, was of quite different actual length. In the case of the Quendi, similar differences occurred in comparing other kinds of growing creatures, or even other varieties of similar kinds. Thus, animals age at different rates measured by years of Middle Earth, MY or sun years, and so do different varieties of men, so did even different varieties of the Quendi. The elder grew to maturity less quickly than did the Avari. Footnote 16. As first written, this paragraph ended. The Noldor grew to maturity less quickly than did Sindar. The alteration was made in broad nib pen in the act of writing. End footnote. In their beginning, the Quendi grew at a rate in which the unit was the yen, or Elven year, which was 144 MY. If then an elf child grew to a maiden and a young woman in about 20 years, wedded at 25 and bore her first child at 26, her age in mortal terms would be 2,880 at maturity, 3,600 at wedding, and 3,744 at childbirth. This speed of growth and rate of aging had nothing to do with the perception of time. As the elders say of themselves, and this may in some degree also be true of men, when persons, in whole being, Vea and Heroa, are fully occupied with things of deep natural concern and of delight to them, and are in great bliss and health, time seems to pass quickly and not the reverse. The minute enjoyment and appreciation of events and thoughts in the time series does not, as might be supposed, make time seem longer, as might a road or path that was minutely inspected. For that inspection could only be carried out by slowing the rate of normal travel. But the rate of normal progress through time cannot be slowed, but the speed of thought and action can be quickened so as to achieve more in a given space of time. Footnote 17. Regarding the perception of time, see chapters 12 concerning the Quendi in their mode of life and growth, and 20 time and its perception below. End footnote. Thus the Quendi did not and do not live slowly, moving ponderously like tortoises, while time flickers past them and their sluggish thoughts. Indeed, they move and think swifter than men, and achieve more than a man in any given length of time, but not on a wholly different time scale. Thus to a man elves appear to speak rapidly but clearly, unless they retard their speech for man's sake, to move quickly and featly, unless they are in urgency or much moved, when the movement of their hands, for example, may become too swift for human eyes to follow closely, and only their thought, perception, and reasoning seem normally beyond human speed, and but they have a far greater vitality and energy to draw upon, so that it takes and will take a very great length of time to expend it. Thus, we may observe that all matters of growth and development which belong to the separate nature of the Heroa, engaged in its own process of achieving its complete and mature form, and which are not under the will or conscious control of the Fea, proceed far slower among the Quendi than among men. Gestation, therefore, proceeds according to the growth and aging scale of the Quendi, and occupies 3/4 yen or 108 MY. Footnote 18. As first written, This paragraph ended. Occupies a whole yen or 144 NY. Tolkien placed an X next to this paragraph, apparently considering it for change or deletion, but did not in the event actually strike it through. The changes to the time occupied by gestation were made in red ballpoint pen. And footnote. During all this time, the parents are aware of the growth of the unborn child and live in much longer and more deeply felt joy and expectation, for childbirth is not among the Eldar accompanied by pain. Footnote 19. On the lack of pain during childbirth among the Eldar, see the fall of man in Appendix 1. End footnote. It is nonetheless not an easy or light matter, for it is achieved by much greater expense of the vigor of Heroa and Fea, of youth, as the Eldar say, than is usual among men, and is followed after the beginning by a time of quiescence and withdrawal. Footnote 20. With this greater expense of the vigor of Heroa and Fea, of youth, as the Eldar say, than is usual among men in the begetting of children, cf. X 2:12. End footnote. The elf women also are usually quiescent and withdrawn before and after birth. For these reasons, the Eldar did not, if they could avoid it, enter into the time of the children in times of trouble or wandering. There were thus no marriages or births during the Great March, nor again during the journey of the Noldor from Aman to Beleriand, and births were few during all the war against Morgoth. For the same cause, men who had dealings with the Eldar often saw far less of the elf women and might even be unaware that some elven king or lord had a wife, for the withdrawal and quiescence of the wife might occupy the whole time of his sojourn among the Eldar, or indeed much of his whole mortal lifetime. For this withdrawal, occupying from 3 to 4 months or 12ths of a year, that is 1/4 to 1/3 of a yen, with immortal terms endure for about 36 to 48 years. Asterisk. But in Middle-earth, where men and elves met, the rate was already quickened to 100 = 1. Therefore, here we should have 25 or 33. End asterisk. On the other hand, the act of procreation, being of a will and desire shared and indeed controlled by the Fea, was achieved at the speed of other conscious and willful acts of delight or of making. It was one of the acts of chief delight, in process and in memory, in an elvish life, but its intensity alone provided its importance, not its time or length. It could not have been endured for a great length of time without disastrous expense. Footnote 21. An earlier and increasingly hastier and difficult version of this concluding section, subsequently struck through, reads, "Thus the Queni do not live slowly, achieving in 144 years only what a mortal could in 1 year. They are not like tortoises moving ponderously while time flickers past them. Actually, they move and think rather swifter than men and get more into any given length of time than any man could. But they have a much greater natural vitality and energy to draw upon, so that it takes very much longer to expend it all. The procreative act and gestation thus take place quickly at more or less mortal speed, not taking 144 times as long. In fact, the act of union does take longer, and gestation a little longer. Gestation, occupies a loa or sun year in Middle-earth. But the production of children expends a very great amount of physical and spiritual energy. The desire for the next act is therefore at the elvish rate, and when we speak of a 3-year interval, we thus mean for 32 years. All matters of growth, which are not directly controlled by the conscious Fea, are slow in Quendi. Gestation therefore takes a very long while, about 144 NY, during all of which time husband and wife are conscious of the growth of the child and experience a much longer joy and expectation. For elvish childbirth is not accompanied by fear or pain. But there is a great expense of vigor followed by quiescence and weariness in both of them. But the act of procreation not being one of growth until the union of the seed, and being under full control of the will, does not take long, though it is longer and of more intense delight in elves than in men, too intense to be long endured. End footnote. The text ends here, about 2/3 down the page. At a later point, Tolkien wrote in pencil in the bottom margin, "This will not fit the narrative in the Silmarillion. What of Maeglin?" On this matter, see the text presented here as chapters 10, Difficulties in Chronology, 11, Aging of Elves, and 16, Note on the Youth and Growth of the Quendi.